Welcome to the official documentation of the Mesh Deformation Package 2022. In this documentation, we will go through all the modifiers and we will learn how to use the Mesh Deformation package in practice. There are plenty of older documentations that are still relatable nowadays, but I wanted to make a latest brief summary in one video to save your time. This documentation will be a little bit longer, so if you need a specific part, you can just skip there. So let's get into it. The package is divided into 5 major categories: essentials, modifiers, shapes, shaders, and utilities. Let's talk about the first one, the essentials. Essentials category consists of a base component called MeshProEditor, and the other two for Vertex manipulation and runtime and for MeshColliderRefreshing. MeshProEditor is basically a base component that helps you to manage mesh identity and navigate to all the available modifiers. It's divided into 4 subparts: vertices, collider, identity, and modification. You can see content for each subpart by clicking one of them. If you click vertices subpart, you can see the points on your mesh have been generated. These points represent vertices. You can manipulate with them and do whatever you wish. The generated points are basically generic game objects. If the generated points are too small, you can adjust the size by the size multiplier. To see changes, press the vertices button again. There is an option called Animation Mode, which will keep the currently generated points. This option is recommended when you would like to edit mesh at runtime with generated points. Otherwise, the generated points will not be attached to the current mesh after hitting the play button. You can also freely customize generated points appearance. Vertex tool window allows you to manipulate with mesh and generated points in more depth. You can attach selected meshes, clone, weld points, and so on. Don't be afraid to experiment and play around, but always make a copy of your original mesh in case you mess up. And the last option in the vertices subpart is a zone generator, which allows you to generate points in a specific radius that you can see in the scene window. This is great if you would like to keep activated just specific points or you just want to save a performance. Please keep in mind that this is not an optimal mesh editor for high poly meshes. Maximum recommended vertex count for this vertex editor is 2000. Please read the official documentation with the performance slide for more information. Moving on to the next subpart, you can add MeshColliderRefresher, which I will talk about later. Next, we've got a mesh identity subpart, which allows you to create a new mesh reference and save mesh to the assets folder. I guess the other options make sense, but in general, create new reference on copy-paste will create a new mesh reference if you copy-paste current object. Update every frame will update the current mesh state every frame. Otherwise, you can do it manually in case of saving the performance. Optimize mesh will ignore normals and bounds, and the alternative normals will recalculate normals in custom algorithm thanks to the angles. This usually evaluates better results as Unity's regular normals recalculation doesn't do that much job. All the detailed information can be found in the official documentation, or you can easily hover your cursor over the fields to see tooltips. The last subpart, Mesh Modification, contains internal mesh modifiers and external mesh modifiers. The major difference is that internal modifiers are applied right away without manipulating with components, and external modifiers will replace the current MeshProEditor component with advanced settings. Mesh Smooth will smooth the noisy surface of your mesh. Mesh Subdivide will populate mesh with vertices. There is no undo, so be careful. You can always restore your original mesh. And now, moving on to the real-time vertex manipulation. Let's set up a real-time vertex manipulation for standalone application. All you need to do is to select the main camera, add MeshEditorRuntime, and assign the main camera to the required field. Also, make sure that all your editable objects contain MeshProEditor with enabled animation mode. And now, we can freely edit points. You can also play around with values on MeshEditorRuntime, such as switching the editor to the axis editor mode, which consists of an axis object, and you can basically select vertices and move them in all 6 directions. For mobile support, just enable mobile support field, and there we go. Now, let's set up the MeshEditorRuntime for VR. The setup is very simple. Just select one of your VR controllers, add MeshEditorRuntimeVR, and we are done. Now, we need an input handling for MeshEditorRuntime so the component knows when we press or release trigger to drag-drop points. There are 2 ways for handling the input. The first one is that you can create your own input handler and simply call the method in the MeshEditorRuntimeVR. The method has a parameter in the brackets that sets the actual input for the real-time mesh editor in VR. I've got a quick sample here, take a look. And the second way is to use the created platform dependency input that I created for you to save your time again. The only limitation is that the scripts work just for specific components such as MeshEditorRuntimeVR, Sculpting Lite VR, and MeshPaintVR only. However, if you need a very simple input handling for pressing and releasing one button, you can use this method. There are free integrations for free frameworks: Unity's built-in XR, SteamVR, and Oculus integration. Each integration has the very same structure of input, so you don't have to be worried about missing something out. I'm going to import the XR integration as I mostly prefer the built-in library. Also, make sure you've got your chosen framework imported first, before importing the input integration from the Mesh Deformation package. As you can see, the folder with a few scripts and example scenes popped out in the assets folder, and now all I need to do is to select my controller that contains the MeshEditorRuntimeVR and add MDInputVR script. Also, everything is mentioned at the very top of the script, that I need to add proper input VR script for specific platform. And we are done! I can choose which button will control my vertex drag-drop functionality, and we can test it out. As I mentioned earlier, the process of setting up this kind of input handling is the very same with all the other integrations that you can find in the VR preg folder of the Mesh Deformation package. Now let's move on to the very last essential component, and that's MeshColliderRefresher. MeshColliderRefresher allows you to refresh your Mesh Collider with various settings. I added a MeshColliderRefresher to my object, and you can see you can choose Collider Refresh type, which basically means how the collider should be refreshed at runtime. You can choose just once, in a specific interval, every frame, or never. You can do it manually. There is also an option for convex mesh collider in case of using rigid body objects and physics. I guess that's all for the MeshColliderRefresher component. There is nothing really to talk about. For further information about its API, visit the official documentation. we have gone through all the essential components in the Mesh Deformation package. Now, let's jump to the Modifiers category. Mesh Deformation package contains a bunch of well-known modifiers with endless potential. Let's start with the logical deformers. Mesh Morpher allows you to blend or morph a specific mesh between other meshes. There is not much science and it's not that complicated modifier. All you need is a group of various shapes of the same mesh and there we go. So now I'm going to create some variations of the mesh and save them as an asset in the assets folder. Now, select the mesh with the Morpher modifier, assign the saved meshes to the Target Meshes field and press Register Target Morphs button. Our meshes have been registered to the Morph modifier. If you change the index to the index of any target mesh and if you move the blend value property, you can see the current mesh is changing its shape. You can also enable interpolation for smoother results of mesh blending. Moving on to the Mesh Effector. Mesh Effector allows you to affect mesh with weight points. This modifier is great for making holes or bumps. I'm going to create a simple sphere that will represent a weight point for our Mesh Effector modifier. Assign the sphere to the required field of the weight point, press refresh effector weights and we're all set. Now you can play around with the weight values to see various results. If you can't really see any changes on your mesh, make sure your mesh has a sufficient amount of vertices. To increase the vertex count, go to the MeshProEditor and subdivide your mesh. FFD, or Freeform Deformation modifier, is one of the most useful modifiers in the package. It allows you to generate a grid that will affect your mesh with certain weights and density. Choose the FFD type, customize an appearance of the generated waypoints, and hit the Refresh FFD Grid button. Now you can easily manipulate with generated waypoints. The more waypoints you generate, the more details of the mesh will be affected and the more performance it takes. There are many other options below that may help you to edit your mesh in more details. MeshCut allows you to cut any mesh in any direction. All you need is a cutter source, which can be created by clicking the button below or just create an empty object and add a mesh cutter script. Mesh cutter is basically a source of mesh cutting or a blade which will help us to cut the mesh. Now you can play around with other options below. You can add rigid body after cut or add a separation offset. Enable the Cut Automatically field to keep searching for the potential cutter sources. If you hit play and move the cutter source to the mesh, you can easily cut the mesh. If you would like to process your own cut method, just call this method. I made a quick sample, so take a look. It can be any easier. Now, let's move on to the word interactive modifiers. Interactive Surface is a great modifier to process basic simulations on any mesh, for example a mud, snow or a very simple water. The modifier runs mostly through CPU, which calculates positions of the vertices. As you can see, we've got many fields that control how the modifier will behave. You can also enable multi-threading support field in case of complex meshes. I'm talking here about 4000 vertices and beyond. Overall direction tells the modifier in what direction should the interacted vertices move. If you enable exponential deform field, the results of the interactive vertices will be much smoother. You can also edit the softness of the exponential radius. Radius detection size will automatically detect a radius of the collided objects. You can also switch this to the constant value. There are two ways of how to interact with interactor surface modifier: by rigid bodies or by any other non-physical source, such as Raycast event that I will talk about very soon. So let's enable the field called Allow Rigid Bodies, keep the force detections to 0, create a rigid body object that will collide with the modifier, and hit play. Just play around with the values and add again, don't be afraid to experiment. Now I will talk about the Raycast event, which is not really a modifier, but it helps you a lot in interaction with other modifiers. Raycast event is an helpful modifier that allows you to cast a ray with events. You can edit the ray's length and choose between pointer and spherical ray. Let's add a new event right after the ray hits our interactor surface modifier. Assign the interactor surface modifier and assign the ray event to the parameter field. If you hit play and move with the Raycast event, you can see it's interacting with the modifier. But you can also use this for your own purpose. It's basically a Raycast process without coding. Let's move on to the surface tracking, which is very similar to the interactor surface modifier, but this runs through render textures and mostly through GPU. It's much cheaper and it evaluates cheaper results as well. All you need to do is to create a new material with a light mesh tracker shader and set up the surface tracking layers. You can create a brand new layer name or you can do it manually. I will create the new name and hit the button below to complete the setup of the surface tracking modifier. As you can see, it says that we need a material with light mesh tracker shader, which we do have. So now, let's create a sphere or any other renderer object, set its layer to the layer that we have chosen, and hit play. Now, if you move close enough the object above the object with surface tracking modifier, you can see it's slightly deforming its surface. You can also play around with the material that our object has. So you can increase the vertex count with tessellation and also set the upper and lower color of the created tracks. Of course, there are many other options on the material for normal texture, specular volume, emission, track depth, displacement track, and so on and on. Mesh damage is another very useful modifier that allows you to deform or just literally damage any mesh. There are many options that allows you to set the proper mesh damage in more details. If the mesh receives an impact, the radius is created. The radius has to have some value of the radius impact, so we could know which vertices have been affected. You can disable this option to type your own value, which will be a constant, but for dynamic radius impacts, you can detect the radius size automatically, which basically corresponds to the object's local scale. If the radius is a little bit off, and you would like to add a slight bias, you can multiply the radius by some value. Also, you can add a little softness at the end. The higher the value is, the softer the results will be. Detect force impact is basically a force that will be applied to the vertices inside the radius. It's a value that literally means how far should the vertices go if the damage happens. Again, if the force impact is too weak, you can add a multiplication value. Otherwise, if the force impact detection is disabled, there will be just one constant field available. There's another important option, and that's a force detection level, which corresponds to the required impact force for the mesh damage. If the force is not exceeded, there won't be any mesh damage proceeded. This option only applies for objects with rigid body. These options are under the condition title, which says it all. If you would like to somehow limit the mesh damage modifier, you can set up the following conditions. Continuous effect means that if it's enabled, you would be able to damage the mesh beyond its initial state. Let me demonstrate for better explanation. Now the continuous effect is disabled. As you can see, if I damage the mesh near the hole that I made, the hole will adapt to the damage we have made right next to it, but it won't go further. Now, the continuous effect is enabled and we can literally scratch the mesh and just destroy the whole topology. You can also add your own events for the mesh damage. For example, if you would like to update a mesh collider at the time when the mesh is damaged, you can do it here without even touching the code. There is a whole API available, so don't waste your potential and damage whatever you wish. MeshFit is a modifier that allows you to fit the whole mesh or specific generated points onto any surface. It does what it literally means. It fits the mesh. For the best results, I would rather use planar objects, so here I have a plane. Now I will hit the button for points generation. If the mesh doesn't behave well, you can try to fix it by clicking the second button to refresh its transform. Now my mesh has its points, and now I can play around with other options. This modifier is great for creating decals and other minor props in your scene, or just create something spooky or organic. It looks kinda satisfying, don't you think? Melt Controller allows you to control a melt shader at runtime. All you need is a material with mesh shader, exactly as it says at the very top of the Melt Controller modifier. Edit the values for better melt results and hit play, one of the most basic modifiers that the package offers. Mesh Slime is one of the most satisfying modifiers that we've got here. Mesh Slime allows you to react with meshes in a slimy way. All you need is to be sure that your mesh has a higher amount of vertices and the proper setup of Mesh Slime modifier. Assign the main camera to the required field and hit play. As I touch the mesh with a cursor or finger, you can see I'm creating tracks or holes inside the mesh. So the mesh basically behaves like a slime. I think everybody knows those games where you touch the screen with your finger and it just looks ridiculous. There are many other options in Mesh Slime. You can change the input key, change how the interaction with the mesh will look like, repair feature, drag radius, intensity, and so on. Now, let's jump to the basic modifiers such as twist, bend, and physically based mesh noise. I think I don't have to talk much about these basic modifiers, as there is just one value field which tells you how much the modifier affects the mesh and the other optional fields to achieve more details. These are the old good essentials. Now we've got here one of the most advanced modifiers. It's a Sculpting Lite. The further support for sculpting in the package is no longer available, as I created a completed single plugin fully focused on the advanced sculpting, which is called, obviously, Sculpting Pro. However, if you are still interested in a good sculpting inside Unity, don't stop the video and keep watching. Sculpting Lite is not that far from the Sculpting Pro. The major differences between these two is that the Sculpting Pro handles mesh seams and it doesn't create any stretches, and the performance is slightly on another level. The minor differences are the user interface for sure, the speed of processing the sculpting, brush features and further support. So now the Sculpting Lite in this package is deprecated, so I will no longer update this modifier as it works stable and it can be used in many cases. But let's talk about the Sculpting Lite, not about the Sculpting Pro. If you're interested in the Sculpting Pro version, check it out on my asset store profile. Sculpting Lite allows you to sculpt any meshes, from the simplest one to the most complex. I'm talking here about 50,000 vertices and more. It's a little more complex modifier as it contains a bunch of fields and options that need to be set up before proper sculpting. First off, the Sculpting Lite can be used during the editor or at runtime. To access the Sculpting Lite in the editor, enable In Edit Mode field. Also, very important, make sure your mesh has a sufficient amount of vertices so you could see the results. To increase the amount of vertices, use the MeshProEditor subdivide internal modifier. In the edit mode inside the editor, you can see quick shortcuts for the mesh raise feature, mesh lower feature, revert and mesh restoration. If your mesh is complex, let's say it has around 5000 vertices and more, just enable the multi-threading support field. Now, your mesh is basically ready. All you need to do for sculpting at runtime, just enable the very top option, Sculpting at Runtime. However, if you would like to record a history of your sculpting, such as previous mesh state or brush type, just enable the Record History field, in which you can customize history records. In sculpting settings, you can set how the brush will behave, in which direction should the interacted vertices move, and you can also set the other limitations, such as height limitations or distance limitations. Now let's create something practical. I will create a very basic sculpting editor inside Unity. Now, as I have my UI ready, I'm going to connect my UI to the Sculpting Lite modifier. So, for example, for the brush size, I will connect the event for changing the brush size. I will do the same for the rest of the options. For the brush strength, brush state, sculpting type, and so on and on. And we are done. I can easily sculpt my mesh, and yeah, that's the Sculpting Lite that the package offers. Still powerful. It's basically the same for the VR setup, but all you need to do is to enable the isVR input field, assign the target controller, which will correspond to the origin of the sculpting Raycast, and that's all. Also, you will need some input, Again, you can create your own or you can use the input handler that the package offers. I'm going to use my built-in input handler called MDInputVR. I have been talking about this earlier in the MeshEditorRuntimeVR category. You can jump there if you would like to check it out. SoundReact is another special modifier that allows you to gather audio data from audio source. With the audio data, you can create amazing stuff. Let me show you an example. I've created a procedural hexagon grid. Now I'm going to add an audio source, which will contain a music and the SoundReact modifier. Now I will need to assign the audio source to the SoundReact, and I will create a new output event that will indicate the hexagon grid. So now I would like to synchronize the grid with the audio data. Select the proper event, assign the SoundReact modifier, and that's it. We can tweak the settings for much better results, such as output multiplier, smoothness, and so on. You can also use the audio output inside the script for your own stuff. All you need is to have an access to this variable, nothing else. Here is a quick example of my custom code. Moving on to the next major category, and that's shapes. Package contains procedural mesh generators such as mesh paint, hexagonal grid, various procedural primitives, and so on. All the shapes can be found in the editor, in Hierarchy, Create, 3D Object, MD package. And there you can find all the possible shapes. Let's start with the most basic one, Advanced Plane. Advanced Plane is a procedural mesh that generates a plane. You can customize the plane size in chunks, plane pivot offset, and you can also play around with the angle property. The Advanced Plane has a special non-smoothing shading which could help you to generate a low poly look. It's visible if you apply, for example, a mesh noise to the Advanced Plane. Advanced Shapes is a collection of well-known procedural primitives. You're able to edit the vertex count and other properties of the shapes. Hexagon grid is a procedural mesh that generates hexagonal shapes next to each other. There are plenty of properties that allow you to customize the hexagon grid. As mentioned earlier in the SoundReact modifier, you can use the hexagon grid for music reaction, which is, I guess, pretty cool effect. Path Creator is a great procedural tool for creating simple paths. It's a node-based system, so it's not really hard to understand. It all starts with adding a first node by pressing Add Node under the Node Editor Manipulation title. And now you can just add another node and play around with the other settings such as path size, node size. You can revert normals, apply local scale of the nodes to the path size, and so on. There is an option called Smart Rotation, which helps you to navigate created nodes toward each other. If you would like to load your own path without creating a new one, you can just assign a root of the nodes that you have created and just press the button to load the path. Also, the path behaves differently if you ungroup the nodes. Both options, grouped nodes and ungrouped nodes, have their specialties. And if you're satisfied with your path, you can just hide nodes and disable the update every frame property, or you can just remove the component and delete all the nodes. Tunnel Creator is another great procedural tool for creating simple tunnels. In comparison with the Path Creator, this tool is a little more challenging to use. Let's start with the very basics. I'm going to create a brand new tunnel creator. The very first step is to create our first nodes, obviously. Scroll down and press the Show Tunnel Editor button. The editor window will show up and we can easily add and remove tunnel nodes. Let's create a few of them. Again, this is a node-based system, so it's not that hard to get used to it. Now, there are plenty of options that allow you to edit the created tunnel. If you would like to change the vertex count, you can just change the value and hit apply. Next, you can change the tunnel radius, node size, you can change the tunnel to the hemi-tunnel and so on. Also, you can load your own nodes from the root that you can assign into the field. Next, we've got UV settings. If you would like to apply your own material and fully customize UVs for each chunk, you need to enable the Use Custom UV Data field, and you have to add a tunnel node UV data component to the tunnel node you would like to edit. So let's say this part of the tunnel does not really look great and I would like to customize its UVs. So I will select the node that lies in this part and I will add a tunnel node UV data component. Now I can play around with the UV settings and you can see changes pretty quickly. There is an option called Smart Rotation, which helps you to navigate created nodes toward each other. This simplifies the editor workflow for you. Let's talk about advanced features of the Tunnel Creator. Let's go back to the Tunnel Creator editor window and let's open up the Node Editor features that lie in the middle of the window. If you would like to save some time of making turns or straight lines, you can just select one of these features. In case of making a straight line, or if you would like to organize specific nodes in one line, press Make Straight Line button, assigned from node and to the node, set the distance and press apply. You can still edit the distance and press apply to see changes. For the turns, do the same. And if you need to fix your turn, just go back to the straight line feature and apply there. In case you've got more tunnels, you can connect them together by assigning the last node of the first tunnel and the first node of the second tunnel. And that's it. If you are done, you can just hide all the nodes and disable Update Every Frame property, or you can just delete the component with the nodes. How simple is that? MeshPaint is another great procedural tool for creating or simply painting a mesh in the virtual world. Create an empty object and add a MeshPaint component. The component contains a bunch of options, but no worries, you will get used to it. First, you can choose your platform. Next, we've got the very basic parameters such as brush size, smooth movement and rotation, distance limitation, and so on. At the very bottom of the brush settings, you can select your desired shape type. There are actually 3 shape types, but there can be more available in the future. Next, we've got a paint logic that controls how the mesh painting system will behave. Would you like to draw on a screen with a specific depth from the camera? Just choose Draw on the Screen option. Would you like to draw in 3D space, hitting the surrounding objects? Just choose Draw on Raycast hit. You can also customize your own drawing which is great when you use VR platform. Also, don't forget that each property and field contains tooltip, so you don't miss any information. Tooltips can be accessed by hovering your cursor over the desired field. You can choose between two types of how your painted mesh will look like. You can use custom materials or just colors. Each slot can be customized, and each slot represents a specific index that you can use to indicate which one is selected for the final painted mesh. And at the end, you can add a mesh collider to your painted mesh. There is an additional field called Custom Brush Transform, which allows you to create a visual brush transform of mesh painting. Otherwise, there won't be any visual brush, just your cursor or nothing. If you want to skip the whole setup process, you can just choose one of the presets below. Need a 2D painting, 3D or VR painting? Just hit the button one of the presets. Now let's create something practical, such as very simple mesh painting at real time. I'm going to create a user interface, which I will later connect with the mesh painting component. So now, for changing the shape, I will choose an event on the button that will indicate to the event of changing the shape type on the mesh paint component. And again, do the same for the rest of the UI elements, such as changing the brush size and final mesh appearance. And there we go, our simple painting scene made in a few seconds. Let's create a very simple painting in VR. Just import your target VR platform, add a proper MDInputVR component to one of your controllers that also contains the mesh paint component, and there we go. I've been talking about the MDInputVR component in the MeshEditorRuntimeVR part, so please jump there for more information. We are talking there about the simple VR input that package contains. There is a major shader called Standard Deformer, which only works in standard renderer pipeline. Create a new material and apply the Standard Deformer. There are plenty of fields that you can play around with. Standard Deformer will help you to deform any mesh in very interesting ways. You can of course edit all the essential materials channels, such as albedo, normal, specular, and emission. There is a lot of potential in using the Standard Deformer shader, as you can save a lot of performance and time. For example, there is a game called Sea Orchestra, which is built just from this shader. Please visit this video to learn more how the game was built using the shader. The package also contains very useful utilities library that you can use in your code. If you are an experienced programmer, I assume you will easily find what you're looking for in the code. The API is very easy to understand. Let's talk about a very important window, and that's Preferences. Preferences in the package allows you to control how the package in the editor will behave. Preferences can be found in Window/MD package. There are several options. The first one, Pop-up editor windows if any notification, means that if anything happens in the editor window, the display yellow will show up. This can be sometimes a little bit annoying, so you can turn this off. But if you would like to double check things, I suggest you to keep this enabled, as you can miss your mesh data very easily without noticing. Create new mesh reference as default means that always when you add a new modifier or copy-paste any object with any modifier, the new mesh reference will be created. Auto recalculate normals as default means exactly what it says, that every modifier will set its normals to auto recalculate normal as default. Alternate normals recalculation as default means that if you enable this option, the modifiers will use alternate normals recalculation instead of generic unities built-in method. And the difference? Just take a look. The object on the left uses generic unities normals recalculation. The object on the right uses the package alternative method. Basically, the alternative method is more editable and flexible. Auto recalculate bounds as default means again exactly what it says. And the last one is the max vertex count, which will warn you in case you exceed this value. If there are more options in the preferences window and you are watching this from a far future, please visit the official documentation for more information. There are plenty of applications and games that use the package as an essential toolkit for their development. It's been already 7 years and the package still exponentially grows, and it's all thanks to you, to the community and people who support this package. Big thanks again. I hope I have mentioned everything technical about this package and you have understood everything, or at least what you needed to understand. If you have any questions, issues or suggestions, please join my official Discord community server in which we can talk in real time and you can meet many other developers. Thanks for watching and good luck.